Hi, my name is Etta Grace, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today, I am interviewing Jordan King about his debut novel, White Oaks, which he was so kind to send me a physical copy of. I think this is the first book I've ever reviewed that I actually have a physical copy of when I reviewed it. Most of them I bought after the fact, but this was a lot of fun to go through and bookmark all of my favorite scenes, and I am very excited to be talking to you today. So, first, do you want to go through and tell me a bit about yourself and how you started writing and what it is that you write?
Yeah, great. Thank you for having me on here today. I really appreciate it. And thank you for reading the book as well. I write a lot of different things, but my focus is primarily on horror, speculative fiction, and light fantasy. And writing is something that I always had an interest in, even as a kid. But it was something that I never really took seriously until about 15 years ago when I got an office job with the government. And I was so bored most of the time that I just started manufacturing all of these very detailed daydreams that would end up following me out the door and wouldn't leave me alone until I started writing them down. So that's kind of how I got started. And initially when I started writing, um, I joined a local writing workshop and went to some local conferences and read some how-to books and spent a long time writing my first novel. And that was kind of what I learned how to write with, or how not to write with, more accurately. And then after I finished that, I spent a couple years looking for an agent, and just felt like something else was missing in my writing. And I had enough money left over in my GI Bill to cover a master's program, so I went to Miami of Ohio for my MFA, and White Oaks was actually my thesis project for that program.
That's awesome. So, what was the idea for White Oaks? You said that you came into it with a lot of daydreams, and you sent me with the book a newspaper snippet, which I thought was so cool, about a Sawyer sanatorium. Oh, it's not showing up. There we go. And I thought this was super neat. So, I'm just curious about what was the idea for this story.
So White Oaks is a very personal book, which is not really what I set out to do. I'm a very private person from a very private and quiet family. But a lot of what fueled the book was just kind of an open wound in my life that writing about started to close. And since it was such a personal story from the beginning, I started pulling other elements of my life into the story, and that's where the Sawyer Sanatorium actually comes into it. That's was a mental hospital that was actually in the town where I live in now, and the main doctor's name was Sawyer, and that's where I got the name for the main antagonist in the book. And that hospital is on what's now White Oaks Road. So those are a couple things just from the town where I live in that were thrown in as well.
I see. And of course, you don't have to share anything you're not comfortable with. Um, so the next question is about the main character Jason and his arc. He has a arc where he's struggling with a lot of personal issues at the beginning, but he learns to trust the other patients at White Oaks and become friends with them over the course of the story. And I thought that was really great. And so, how did you develop his arc and how he learns to trust other people and work with them over the course of the story?
Yeah. Well, like I said, White Oaks is a pretty personal book, but outside of those elements being explored and developed kind of throughout the narrative, I also asked a lot of questions of Jason at the beginning of the process. Did he really want to get clean and why? If he were to get clean, what would the circumstances be? I started just asking a lot of what if questions, like, what if he did get clean, but it wasn't by choice, and what might those circumstances be? How would he respond to them? And I just got oceans of text in response to those questions, and then just started organizing things and trying to evenly spread them throughout the book.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's a very complex issue, and he has a lot of different things going on, and so I think it was handled very well in the story. It all felt very natural, and he's a very compelling character and a very sympathetic character throughout the whole story too. And so I really liked him even from the beginning, and I wanted to see him succeed and escape.
Great.
Each of the different side characters all have unique issues and personalities of their own too, but as Jason gets to know them, they all develop the sense of camaraderie. And so, how did you keep them distinct and introduce them to the reader in a memorable way?
Um, that's a great question. I keep them distinct by thinking of them and seeing them as real people going through real things.
Mm,
I'll often place certain personality traits of real people that I know into my characters, even really simple things like a hairstyle or the use of a certain expression. And that just helps them become even more real and autonomous individuals.
mm.
And when I think of them as actual individuals separate from me, it becomes a lot more natural to write them in ways that make them distinguishable as such. As far as like making them more memorable, um, I think the way that's most natural for me is through establishing an emotional attachment right away, to humanize the characters and make them individuals as quickly as possible. Sometimes I do that by making them vulnerable, sometimes just by making them a little bit strange. But even the strangeness isn't there just to be strange. It's always a window into something else, some deeper part of that character that will likely come into play later on in the story.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Everything felt very purposeful and intentional as I was reading.
Hmm.
There was a lot of foreshadowing and a lot of, I guess foreshadowing would be the right word for it. That all of the characters eventually opened up to Jason in one way or another. That they either got to know each other in good ways or bad. Um, I'm trying not to spoil everything, but it's hard when it's something I've reviewed already.
Right.
um, that's the hard part about doing these interviews after the fact.
Yeah.
uh, but they're all lovely. I think my favorite character was Michael, and then the other one at the end who helps him. I'm forgetting his name now. What is it? Duke was
Uh,
another good one, and
yeah.
then there's another one who helps Ava at the end. What's his
Kevin.
name? Kevin.
Maybe?
Yes.
Yeah.
They were all very, very great. From the beginning, we know that something's wrong with the facility again from the warning of another side character um, that Jason doesn't believe at first. But as Dr. Sawyer grows more sinister, we start to get more clues about the truth. And so, how do you balance the mystery of the unknown with the horror of the reality that they're experiencing? Because as you learn the truth, you lose the mystery, but you still need to keep it scary for it to be like a horror and a thriller. So
Right.
you lose the unknown, but you need to keep the stakes up. So how do you balance those two traits?
Yeah, yeah, that's tough. Well, like, there's a lot going on for all the characters in White Oaks. So just looking at the main character, Jason, he's dealing with PTSD and chronic pain and other chronic health issues, suicidal depression, the deep shame associated with the killing of his best friend, whose ghost follows him around in the story, sometimes showing up very unexpectedly. He's detoxing from various powerful drugs while trapped in a location in the middle of nowhere that's a source of continuous chaos and confusion and hostility. So the mystery of what the facility is and how that unfolds was really deliberately placed and spaced more than anything to give readers and myself as the writer a break from all of the emotional and physical turmoil that each character is going through. um, and that like the mystery of the facility was kind of like my escape, and was kind of hoping was a little bit of an escape for the readers as well, because it is, there's a lot of an emotional weight to the story. Um, so it's also tricky while you're writing, because you want to keep the mystery alive, and but you also don't want to be too mysterious. But you normally know everything that's going to happen, so it's kind of hard to like balance it out, keeping it mysterious while you know everything that's coming anyway. So sometimes I'll give that stuff to like beta readers or to some family members or whatever, and if they can figure out stuff a little bit sooner than I want them to, then I know that it's time to start working on some of that. So
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially what you said about like you as the writer know everything that's going to happen, and so putting yourself in the head of an audience who doesn't is kind of difficult.
right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I
That
have
kind
to
of
kind of
ties.
forget that you know that stuff every once in a while.
That kind of ties into my next question too about much of Jason's history, what he went through in the war with killing his best friend, and his history of substance abuse is all of that shown through bits and pieces and flashbacks. And so when it switches into that past tense in the flashback, you have to choose when to share that backstory and what scenes of his past to divulge and in what order. And so, how
Right.
did you decide when to fit what scenes into the book and what order and where? And you can answer this with as much or as little spoilers as you like.
Yeah. Um, so so White Oaks actually started as a short story.
Mm-hmm.
If you look in the book, chapter 4 is a version of that original short story. And that part of the book takes place in Afghanistan and is kind of a snapshot of how the character was injured and the chronic pain and substance abuse that followed in the years after that. So the story kind of branched off into different directions from that original short story. And so once it became a more localized story taking place inside a mental hospital, I needed a way to get the story outside of that environment, if only for moments in time. And the flashbacks that I used were all really purposeful to help establish depth in the characters and themes and the themes being explored. The flashbacks used were all sources of trauma that the characters eventually had to process through and move forward from, and they were all things designed to bring the readers closer to Jason emotionally.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Because all of those were moments that he was able to mentally escape White Oaks for a minute, even if it wasn't necessarily a nice escape. It was taking him back to
Right,
something hurtful, but it was a
right.
moment that we were removed from the context of the mental hospital and taken to a different time.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have a favorite scene to write?
Honestly, it's been long enough since I finished writing it that I don't really remember a specific scene that was my favorite. But like generally, I really enjoy writing description.
Mm-hmm.
I like really visual writing that's fast paced, especially when I feel like it's easily translatable to cinema.
Mm-hmm.
There were some scenes in White Oaks that I really struggled to write because they were so personal.
Yeah,
But those scenes were also some of the most therapeutic to write, just to give them space on a page that I'd never be able to delete them from.
that makes a lot of sense. I'm glad that this book was able to help you.
Yeah,
Um, this is a sensitive question, so again, you can answer it as much as or as little as you like to your
sure.
comfort. But this book deals with a lot of mental health topics like PTSD and addiction in a very realistic way, and it shows how they can be harmful, but also how Jason is seeking for healing on his own terms and also not on his own terms because he's committed to a mental hospital against his
Right.
will. So, how did you balance this dynamic in your prose, and why did you represent it this way? And you said that you explored a lot of these topics and tried to lay them out and piece them together. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but it kind of takes this final form, and it's a very hopeful story in the end. I thought,
Yeah.
at least from my perspective, having encountered very few of these topics myself, thankfully. But I really ended up enjoying it a lot, and I thought it was very very hopeful and very uplifting in the end, and I really enjoyed it. So I just thought I'd
Awesome.
ask you, why did you choose to represent it this way? And if you're not comfortable answering that, then that's totally fine.
Yeah. No. No. It's fine. Um, So I was honestly kind of learning to balance the things in my prose as I was learning to balance it in my life.
Mm-hmm.
Um, a lot of what's happening with Jason, the kind of dangerous and self destructive behavior that was so harmful, the chaotic and negative internal processes, and the search for healing, those things feel realistic because there's so much truth layered into those sections. Much of the book is fictionalized, but many of the scenes involving seemingly lethal amounts of drugs absurdly mixed and combined with alcohol are not fictional. And none of the descriptions of pain are fictionalized. Some of those things are actually things I've said to doctors. So it feels realistic because it is.
I'm
But
sorry you.
I'm glad that you took it as a hopeful and uplifting story in the end,
Mm-hmm.
especially considering the context of what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Um, I'm sorry that you've had to experience those things, and I'm glad that Jason is able to find an escape in the end. And I hope that you're able to find healing as well.
Yeah, I
And
was.
I'm glad
Thank you.
that this book was a help for you. Um, is there
Yeah,
anything
in
else?
various ways.
Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about in regards to the story? I always like to ask my authors like a free question. If there's any questions that I missed, just because mental health is such a big theme in the story, I didn't want to like gloss over it. but at the same
Right.
time, I didn't want to be too prying. But just a free question in case I missed anything that you did want to talk about. I always like to give my authors a freebie at the end of these interviews.
Sure. Yeah. Um, so I don't think you missed anything. There wasn't anything specific that I wanted to talk about. However, I will mention that there is a book festival going on tomorrow that I will be at. It's the Newark Book Festival. I will be there along with over 80 other authors. It's their first time doing this festival, so they're kind of going all out and doing a variety of different things. So everybody's pretty excited about it. And even though the book came out about 18 months ago, I've never done a formal reading as a published author. So I'm actually going to be reading there. So if anybody wanted to come out and view me, hopefully not having a panic attack while I'm reading publicly for the first time, it should be fun.
I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you.
It's very exciting. Congratulations.
Thanks.
So, what else are you working on next, and where can we find you and your stories?
So the first and only other thing that I've had published is an essay called Lost Time, a Road Trip Journal. And that was in the February 2019 edition of Adelaide Literary Magazine. I have a speculative fiction novel called Drone that is completed. I've been trying to get that published for a while. So that's not going super great, but I'm continuing to work on that. And Drone is about the friendship between a sentient drone and a refugee boy in the midst of an environmental apocalypse in 2050s Ohio. So
Interesting.
that's what I have done that I'm trying to get out in the world. Right now, I'm working on a series of short stories for an anthology that I'm working on with a group of local writers, which you know about.
Yes.
And I'm also working on a horror fantasy novella called The Other Place. That story is about a man with few memories who can absorb illnesses from other people, and he's transported to another world to deposit them. That story was inspired by Shel Silverstein's The Giving Tree, and also more so by a conversation that I had with my daughter when she was in the early stages of a really long and painful recovery after a major surgery. So that's what I'm working on now. And then there are links to everything on my website at jordankingauthor.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much. If you want me to send me those links, I'll put everything in the description of this video and on the website when I link the transcription to this. And thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today and for sending me a copy of this book. I really enjoyed reading it, and I hope that anybody who needs to read this kind of story also gets the same kind of experience out of this.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you again.